Hello my fellow Victorians, thank you for being with me again. This is part 2 of a series of videos that look into the corrupt practices of the Victorian media. Our news media claim to be an important part of our democracy. In truth, they're nothing of the sort, and in fact impede and manipulate our democracy. You might hope our media would not take sides on political issues and would present all the facts impartially so people would be informed and make their own decisions, but they do nothing of the sort. In the previous video, we saw how one main news channel in Melbourne takes sides in political debates, devises lies, and then uses those lies to promote the interests of one side of politics and silence those on the other side. We saw the Victorian media are really political activists parading as journalists. In this video, we're going to look at why our media don't tell us certain things. For background, we'll look at what the Victorian Bar said about Daniel Andrews' pandemic legislation. The Victorian Bar consists of Victorian barristers and Queen's Counsels. These are very senior people in the Victorian legal system, and they know what they're talking about. Please see link 1 in the description below. The Victorian Bar sees serious problems with Daniel Andrews' pandemic legislation. Let's look at some of what they said. First, Andrews' pandemic law avoids the normal checks and balances of our democratic system. It allows the government to behave autocratically for extended periods of time, and provides grossly insufficient parliamentary supervision over the minister's exercise of his powers. 2. No real ability to hold the minister's power in check. For the minister's orders to be challenged, a government committee must first disallow the ministerial order, and no doubt the minister will first ensure that this committee is staffed by people who either agree with him or who can be controlled by him. In the odd instance that this committee should disallow any of his orders, the state governor, after obtaining the recommendation of the minister, can override the committee and declare his orders not suspended. Basically, the minister could persuade the governor to override the committee. This would be a highly likely outcome, particularly if the public health were at risk. Also, both sides of Parliament need to agree to disallow an order. This would be a lengthy process and also highly unlikely. In Victoria, as the parliamentary houses stand right now, one house might disallow the order, while the other would steadfastly support the order. Essentially, it would be hard, if not impossible, to override the minister's order. This is really no check at all on the minister's power. 3. There is an extraordinary breadth of the minister's power. The minister can make any order, constrained only by the minister's subjective belief that it is reasonably necessary to protect public health. The pandemic law entrenches this broad autocratic power without time limitation. And broad powers can be given to low-level government employees. The bill allows the Chief Health Officer to authorise other officers to take any action or give any direction other than detain a person that the officer believes is reasonably necessary to give effect to a pandemic order or protect public health. These are breathtakingly broad powers, given to people who would include young, inexperienced or untrained low-level government officials. The Charter of Human Rights is used as a check on the exercise of the minister's powers. But if the government doesn't comply with the Charter of Human Rights, they cannot be taken to court. Basically, the government can completely ignore the Charter of Human Rights, and there's nothing that can be done about it. Amazing, isn't it, how Daniel Andrews makes such a big deal about the Charter of Human Rights, then allows himself and his ministers to completely ignore it without repercussions. Also, discrimination based on protected attributes. There is no reason why the minister's orders under this pandemic law can be made to apply to people with certain political beliefs. These have no obvious relevance to a person's health. Also, restricted avenues of appeal for detained persons. The minister can order that someone be detained, and that detention can be extended. The person detained can apply to the Secretary of the Department for review by a detention officer. This is the only avenue available for review. They might also be able to apply to the Supreme Court for a writ of habeas corpus or other judicial review, but this would be incredibly expensive and out of the reach of most people. We need to remember that a person's detention depends only upon the authorised officer being satisfied that continued detention is necessary to eliminate or reduce serious risk to public health. This means that power to detain someone is concentrated under this law to the one authorised officer. This is incredibly authoritarian and autocratic and open to abuse. But it does show the true nature of the Victorian state ALP government, which to date have behaved autocratically, concealed the reasons for their actions, disallowed review or debate on their decisions, and even used the riot and anti-terror police to silence and disperse those who questioned their decisions publicly in protests. So why would anyone write such an autocratic law that impedes or possibly eliminates possible review by the courts? Why concentrate all this power into the hands of one or two government ministers? Why invent orders that apply only to groups of people based on political beliefs, and give no impartial or independent avenue to appeal the minister's orders? This law is not written by a Western democracy. Rather, it seems to be written by power-hungry autocrats. It compares well with laws written by the CCP to oppress dissidents in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. Surely anyone committed to the Westminster democratic system would allow the courts to review and check government decisions, which affects the lives of people. But not under the law Daniel Andrews has written. While the pandemic law itself is a terrible piece of legislation, this is not the whole story. The Victorian media have left out important information that gives us an even better understanding of the motives and character of the Victorian ALP state government. In particular, just how autocratic and intolerant they are of people who don't agree with them, and how they're determined to get this terrible legislation in place. Let's look into that right now. To find out what the Victorian media don't tell us, we need to turn to the foreign news outlets. That's right, to find out the important details of what's happening in Victoria, we need to turn to the foreign press, and I've had to do that more than once in the past. Let me give you my first example. Years ago, when Australia introduced internet censorship, the federal government knew it was a sensitive subject. Our media never told us the date that internet censorship started in Australia. I had to go to the Indian media to find out the date censorship started. That's right, I had to go to India to find out what happened to us in Australia. Getting back to the Victorian pandemic law, what did the Victorian media not tell us about it? Please see link 2 in the description below. This is a link to a US legal publication called The Jurist. Apparently, it's tradition for the Victorian state government to consult with the Victorian bar over proposed new laws. Probably the idea is that the top legal minds in the state may see shortcomings or problems with the proposed law. The Victorian bar were consulted by the government, but this consisted of a 45-minute Microsoft Teams meeting where only the broad issues of the proposed pandemic law were raised. That's all. The details of the law were not raised for examination or discussion. Also, the ALP state government never even gave the Victorian bar a draft of the proposed law. And apparently all consultation ended after that 45-minute Microsoft Teams meeting, and there was no further discussion. This is what the Victorian media decided to leave out and not tell us. So why was that, and what's going on here? It appears the ALP state government knew the Victorian bar would spot the autocratic nature of the proposed law, and also spot the fact that the government could not be taken to court if they acted in bad faith or violated other legislation such as the Charter of Human Rights. So the ALP state government decided to do the bare minimum consultation required, so they could just check off a box and say that they'd done what they should have. And they only raised the broad issues regarding the proposed law. It seems so that none of the unpleasant or contentious details would be revealed to the Victorian bar beforehand. From their approach, it's clear, to me at least, that the Victorian ALP government had no intention of listening to anything the Victorian bar said or suggested, and they shut them out of all the important discussions about the law. We see from other news reports that the only people the state government discussed the legislation with were the 3 independent MPs they needed to get it passed. All this is very illuminating when it comes to understanding what the Andrews government is really like, and it doesn't paint a good picture of the Andrews government. The Victorian media knew that they had to keep this from the public. If we knew the Victorian Bar could see real problems with the new legislation, and the government had already decided that they were not going to listen to them, this would be a serious problem with the government's credibility and reputation. And the Victorian Bar were not holding back this information. They mentioned it to the foreign media that the state ALP government didn't want to consult properly with them or listen to them. So I think it highly likely that they also mentioned this same thing to the local Victorian media. The US media published the problems the Victorian Bar faced, but the local media decided to omit it altogether. This greatly helped the Andrews government get their pandemic law passed. We've seen in part 1 of this series how the media will protect and promote the interests of the ALP, while at the same time put roadblocks in the way of all opposed to the ALP. The Victorian Bar are people who should be involved, listened to, and given a free voice in the media, but the Victorian media will not do that if it is not in the ALP's interests. Again, we see the Victorian media will suppress information needed for a properly functioning democracy. The Victorian media are not impartial observers. They participate in the political process. They are really political activists out to protect one side of politics. They are biased to the core, and their bias overrides all issues of the public interest, public discussion and public views. But they couldn't care less. All they're interested in is making sure the ALP can get what they want, and they protect the ALP whenever they can. This is why we need to go to the foreign media. I'm often impressed by the Indian media, how they report what they know and report both sides of the story impartially. One good source of global news is the Indian YouTube channel TFI Global. I'll provide a link to just one of their articles. Please see link 4 in the description below. And please ask yourself this: would you ever see an article like this in any Australian media outlet? In the TFI Global article, Scott Morrison is praised for his actions restraining the greed and corruption of the Chinese in Papua New Guinea. TFI Global says his name will go down in the history books in gold lettering because of his careful and wise actions. Our local news media would rather stick a knife into Morrison's back than say anything like that. So what else have the local media left out of the news just to protect the ALP? They have left the most important piece of information about the current pandemic out. They cannot bring themselves to acknowledge that it was the state ALP government that allowed the virus to escape and spread into the community at the start of 2020. Please see link 5 in the description below for the news report that includes how the state government treated the workers from Cedar Meats. Sky News found written evidence that Brett Sutton's secretary instructed the private security guards at the quarantine hotels to let the workers from Cedar Meats come and go as they pleased. For everyone else, including people arriving from overseas, the quarantine hotels were mandatory, but not for the unionised workers at Cedar Meats, one of the first workplaces heavily infected by COVID-19. Even Sky News, who revealed this information, did not have the courage to point out that it was Brett Sutton's department, and probably Daniel Andrews himself, who was the direct cause of the COVID outbreaks from the quarantine hotels. Instead, they followed the ALP lie and blamed the private security guards, when in fact it was the government's written instructions to the security guard companies that was the cause of the virus escaping and killing some 800 elderly people in our aged care homes. The ALP spread around disinformation that it was the security guards that allowed the release of the virus, when in fact it was the ALP state government themselves who deliberately allowed the virus to escape. This is the one important fact not one news outlet can bring themselves to even say. In summary, the Victorian media show an irredeemable bias and are corrupt to the very core, willing to do and say anything or withhold any information to protect their ALP. Our media is corrupt and biased beyond belief, to the point that, in my view, they are not fit or proper people to inform anyone about anything. Thank you again for your time, and stay safe from our corrupt state government and their corrupt police.